A few weeks ago, Patty and I went to a new optometrist in Knoxville that was quite interesting. And one of the things that intrigued me about this person to cause me to go to him in the first place is that he talked about how seeing actually operates. So I don't if you've had eye exams lately, I've noticed that they have these new machines that basically don't require you to look at the eye chart anymore. They just look at your eyeball, measure your eyeball, and give you a prescription. So it has to do entirely with the configuration of your eyeball, as if that was the entirety of seeing. And what intrigued me about, I have had that done, it didn't work at all, but what intrigued me about this optometrist is he said that's only actually part of the story, that the eyeball can do what the eyeball does, and to focus the incoming information and convey it to the brain. But then there's a whole interaction that happens in the brain where the brain interprets the signal that's coming in, right? And seeing isn't just the eyeball, it's that combination of the eyeball and the interaction with the brain interpreting that signal, right? So I like that. I like that, there's a deeper understanding of how that mechanism actually works. And it has to do with what we were talking about the other day in terms of how we actually interact with the world is happening within us, right? All of the information that we get comes in through the body, through one sensory perception, one sensory avenue or another. Right? So, the seeing is, in one sense, a physical input, but then there's this interaction that happens between that sensory input from the brain and the interpretation in the mind, which is actually what we see. So there's some YouTube video that I saw a number of years ago. It was quite fascinating. It was two teams of basketball players, and you were asked to just count the number of times that this one team passed the basketball to each other for, 45 seconds or so. And then you were asked, did you see anything unusual? Or how many times did they pass the ball? And you could say how many times you passed the ball. But what you missed was that there was someone in a gorilla suit walking through the middle of the action that you failed to notice. It only took me 3 times to notice the gorilla. But that's the mind. There's not a problem with the eyeball, right? It's how the mind operates to filter out things that isn't relevant, or the mind decides isn't relevant, or it doesn't want to see. So something that extreme, clearly, right? I mean, this once you saw it, you couldn't not see it. It was so obvious. It wasn't lurking in the background. He was in the middle of the action, this gorilla. It wasn't a real gorilla. It was somebody dressed as a gorilla. So there's this mental, subconscious processing that's happening where the brain decides what's important to see and what's not. And this, has had an evolutionary purpose, right? If there was, if you suddenly sensed the tiger in the weeds, your mind, it was of evolutionary benefit to focus on the tiger and forget about everything else. Forget about the bird chirping, forget about the breeze in the trees, forget about your back aching, everything, only the tiger. So we're real good at sort of not registering what we consider unimportant. and just focusing on what's the most interesting, the most valuable, the most frightening, the most whatever at that moment. So it's not that all of the other information isn't coming into our eyeball. The eyeball's taking it all in, but it's the brain that sorts through it and say, okay, focus on this. But we also do the same thing when something's bothering us, right? We if it's bothering us to the degree that it really grabs our attention, suddenly nothing else matters. It's that issue that has to be resolved, that's felt. And the body, as we talked about yesterday, is a sensing organism. That's what it does, through our five senses, through the sense of, internal sense of aliveness. The body, that's how we experience the world, through those senses. So now there's this sensation, this feeling, this construct of something bothering us, right? So it can grab our attention. We can try to push it away, not see it if we don't really want to, forget about it for a few years. But sometimes things have a persistence. If they're significant to us, can be a source of suffering, can continue to arise until we deal with it. So one of the phrases that's real common, I think it's even a legal phrase, but it's pain and suffering, right? It's almost a hyphenated word. It's used together, pain and suffering. But it's actually useful to make a distinction between pain and suffering. Pain is, there can be physical pain. I mean, you stub your toe, it hurts. You close your fingers in the car door, it hurts. You get a headache, it hurts. A friend dies, it hurts. So this is pain. There's, it's an actual direct experience. Grief. The distinction that I'd make between pain, that direct sensory perception, I mean, we can also talk about joy, right? But normally we don't talk about joy and suffering, we talk about pain and suffering. So the distinction between pain, which is that direct experience of hurt, and suffering is what we tell ourselves about the pain. And often, what we tell ourselves about the pain can cause us more sorrow in the long term than the actual pain itself. If there's a hurt, somebody, a friend decides to, leave our friendship, maybe a lover, that can cause pain, right? That loss of, physical presence, companionship, it can feel like a loss, right? The suffering comes in when we tell ourselves that shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't have done it. They didn't treat me fair. I deserve better. On and on and on. That's what holds that pain in place. It can hold it in place for a long, long time. So the direct sensory experience is something that the body's informing us about. It's informing us about a loss of connectivity, a loss of intimacy, maybe, or it could be a physical pain. It can be a direct physical sensation. The suffering is something that we do to ourselves up here. Pain, often not optional, happens. It's happened to all of us. The suffering part's optional. And the suffering part is caused by stories that we tell ourselves and we believe. We believe that that shouldn't have happened, it wasn't fair, wasn't right, the world shouldn't be this way, I don't deserve it, on and on and on, whatever our storyline is. And that storyline, the more we tell ourselves that story, the more real it feels, the less likely we're willing to let it go at some future point, you know. This person left me 20 years ago, you know, nothing's, you know, happened in the last 20 years to change that fact, and yet we go on suffering because of it. We hold that onto ourselves. So this suffering, normally what we want to do with that is just try to make it go away, right? We distract ourselves. You know, there's lots of things to distract ourselves with. Entertainment, drugs, alcohol, movies, you know, the next email. I mean, there's just all of that to try to keep that suffering at a distance. But the problem with trying to keep the suffering at a distance is we don't ever address the cause of it, which is self-inflicted. It's something that we take on ourselves, we believe it's entrenched. It's like, you know, it's like those little Post-it notes you put up on your mirror that says, you know, you're a wonderful person, you know, have a good day, whatever. I mean, the same thing works in as a negative, what do they call the Post-it notes? Affirmations. So there's affirmations and there's defamations, right? Things that you tell yourself that have just the opposite effect, you know. They probably are more powerful, actually, you know, because we can hang on to them. But the power comes from the belief that that thought is actually true. So the solution isn't, well, I'll just take a pill and make my suffering just feel less important. I mean, that's how it's normally dealt with, right? Pill in some form or another. But if the real freedom from that is to look at what those thoughts that are creating the suffering are based on, you know, if they're actually true. I mean, should this person have left me or not? Well, I don't know, but it happened. That's the reality of it. You know, everything else is a story about what should have happened or might have happened or if only, or, you know, if I hadn't done this, they hadn't done that. All of that's a story. And that story is only kept alive in our repetition of it. It's sort of like, you know, the ancient ones sitting around the campfire telling the stories over and over again until they became real. You know, we do it to ourselves. So in Buddhism, they talk about one of the characteristics of life itself is suffering. Well, sometimes, yeah, not always, clearly. I mean, sometimes life is really good. It's fun, enjoyable, right? And even that translation may be an overstatement. It's also sometimes interpreted as sort of a discomfort or you know, sort of a lump on the tire when you're driving. You know, it sort of jars you every once in a while. But the point I'm trying to make about suffering is that when we find ourselves suffering, rather than trying to get rid of it, it's actually our body informing us that there's something that's not in alignment with who we actually are. So trying to push it away or disregard it is you know, isn't really helpful. You know, if we have a little cut on our hand, we put a Band-Aid on and it's fine, you know. But if we have a gushing opened wound, putting a Band-Aid on it isn't really the right strategy. Right? So it's, if we find that if we find ourselves suffering as a result of an old memory or a current unresolved situation, and it comes up into awareness to the point that it's actually a significant part of most days, causing us to drop into this sense of, despair or anger or jealousy or envy or those contraction kind of emotions. If we find that, then it's worth taking a look at that. Not because it's bad or wrong, but just because it's not true. It's not true in the sense that it's all based on a story that we're telling about ourselves. The actual fact has long gone, if we're talking about a past event. It's only kept alive by our repetition and belief over and over and over again, to the point that we conclude that it is who we are. It is an unavoidable, permanent part of our life. So the freedom isn't to try to ignore it, just to try to meditate ourselves into a state where we don't remember that. It's actually to allow that to be seen clearly. Okay, it's something that, an unforgiveness that I haven't let go, judgment that I'm certain is right, that kind of hanging on. So the letting go is, in spirituality, a lot of times they talk about letting go, like, let go, let go. But it's really looking at the little things that we're hanging on to that's significant. What exactly are we hanging on to? Rather than trying to let go. Right? Anybody see that as a bit of an oxymoron, right? Trying hard to let go. But it's really just seeing clearly what we're hanging on to is how that hook is let go of. So suffering, rather than saying suffering is bad and something to be avoided, it's not, I don't mean we should go out and seek suffering. Life does a pretty good job of that itself. But when it arises or it seems persistent or consuming, then it's our bodies informing us this is something to be looked at, right? Very much like we hit our thumb with a hammer. It's like, no, your thumb needs attention right now. Maybe some ice, maybe something. But it's our body informing us that this needs to be taken care of. So the suffering in very much the same way is like the body calling attention to something that needs to be addressed. It's not, our tendency as a culture, is to say, suffering shouldn't happen. Here's a pill, here's a distraction, here's a new relationship, here's something just to get over it. Sort of paper over it and pretend it didn't actually happen. So we can use the body in this sense of ways that we are being informed, right? To value that rather than dismiss it. And the point of seeing through it is just noticing that the degree to which our psychic energy is just held by a certain contraction. An old story that keeps repeating, or a belief about ourselves, I am a unworthy person, Tell ourselves that story over and over again, every day. It has an effect. Has an effect on our body. So we know that. I mean, that's an easy experiment to try on ourselves. I mean, we can sit in a quiet room, everything's just fine, Just had breakfast, nothing much is happening, temperature's about right. And we can recall some painful story of the past, play it, in vivid color in our mind, and, within a few minutes we can feel the physiological change in our body, right? We can feel sort of the anger or distrust or whatever it is welling up, and feel the sweat in the back of our neck. We can feel our belly contract, whatever our tendency is. It's the power of the mind, right? So the body can inform our thoughts, and the other way around too. Our thinking can have a physiological effect on the body. So when there's suffering, it's really an opportunity to look at that rather than try to run away from it, to face it directly. And it's one of the surprising things about retreats, if you're relatively new to them. We all think about, I'm going on retreat, it's all going to be peaceful and nice and quiet, and I'm going to get so serene, and maybe not. It might be an opportunity for some old story that's been held at bay for years, saying, now's my chance to come up into awareness. And if we choose to say, no, that shouldn't be happening, right? This is a meditation retreat. I shouldn't be thinking judgmental thoughts, right? Hey, if that's what's happening, that's what's happening. And I would even suggest not only to sort of grin and bear it, but that it's an opportunity to see it, that it is actually the best possible time for that old memory to come up, because you can have the opportunity to give it time to be seen, to play out, without judgment. Just see, okay, that's what happened. It's impinging on my current reality, and it's time to let it go. And sometimes that's not an easy process to do. It's been held at bay for a reason, and that is you don't want to face the pain. And the way to let it go is to be willing to face the pain. I know that's easier said than done sometimes, but it is the way through it. It's not around it, right? Sometimes spirituality can be used to it's called spiritual bypassing. I have this problem I can't get rid of, but hey, I know I'm awareness, so hey, it's all right. You feel that? It's like I'm just trying to put it in a package over here, sort of distance myself from it, and then pretend it's all okay. But that's not freedom, right? That's a very forced effort to remove ourselves from a process that's really holding us down. The way through it is actually through it. And a weekend like this is an opportunity to do that. Not. I really don't mean that we have to seek out things like, I wonder what it is that I'm suffering from. No, you know. Sometimes we don't want to know that we know, but if we stop and think about it, is there anything that really entangles my energy, sort of grips it and takes a hold and runs with it? Sort of throws me into despair, depression. That kind of movement. We notice that. Well, we can just put a label on it and think, well, that's how I am. Well, I'm just sort of a person who's often depressed. I know there's some kinds of depression or serious mental afflictions that can cause depression, or physical imbalances, or perhaps even genetic things that can cause depression. But I think a lot of depression, what people call depression, is actually our bodies informing us that something isn't quite right. We're living life out of alignment with how life actually is. And it's again, our bodies informing us something isn't quite right. Something to take a look at. Sure, we can medicate it away, sort of. But, what is actually, how am I, removing myself from the reality of life to cause this sort of despair, depression? So it's worth looking at, Again, the same way if I hit my hand, it's worth looking at how to heal that. It's not that the depression is bad or wrong. It can be a perfectly normal response to life as I'm looking at it. Does that make sense? If I look at life as being, what I am is limited to, this body, this situation, what I know is true about the world, and it's a bleak place, and things are going to get worse, and I'm going to grow old and die. I mean, if that's your entire worldview, I mean that's enough to depress anybody, isn't it? The question then, that's what happened to the existentialists, right? Their only solution, well, I'll just throw myself off a bridge. That's the end of that philosophical road, right? But it's actually, it's actually a point through which there's an opportunity to see something else. It's almost as if we have to pass that point of feeling despair, feeling like, the life that I've lived up to this point just isn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought I would be more joyful. I thought there was, I've made these decisions all in the name of my happiness, my joy, and yet it's led to this point. So it's, sometimes it takes that movement to allow to see that our life has actually fallen into despair, to be willing to look at it a little differently. Yeah. Did that ever happen to anybody? Rumi said that, where there is great despair, there is the potential of treasure. Not so much in the despair, just falling into like, oh, everything's hopeless. Not that sense, but that everything that I've done up to this point has led me to a point where life feels hopeless. Okay, am I going to keep pounding away on that same path, or am I going to look for another path? Even raising the question, like, is there another path? Is there another option other than continuing to seek my happiness as a result of external circumstances? If I depend on circumstances to be happy, something good happens, I feel happy, something difficult happens, disturbed by it, I suffer. If that's my view of how life works, then I'm the victim, right? When it's good, it feels good. When it's not, I have no control. It's just total. It's dependent on what's happening out here. Right? And what's happening out here is unpredictable. Right? We can try as hard as we can to sort of arrange our life so that it's, we have our fence around our little yard and sort of keep the world at bay, invite in a few friends and family. We feel safe. But there's still this underlying, anxiety of, what will tomorrow bring? What's going to show up in my face tomorrow to poke a hole in my whole sense of safety? And it can happen just even in little ways. You go to work in the morning feeling pretty good. You go to the copy machine, somebody else shows up there, has some remark about how you're dressed that day or whatever, and suddenly your whole world falls apart, Because we base our happiness on how life reflects us back to us. We don't know who we are, so we're dependent on everybody else to tell us who we are. If they love us, then hey, we're lovable. They don't, not. They like us, I'm worthy. My boss doesn't like me, I'm unworthy. I'm dependent on circumstances. If we believe that what we are is limited to this body, mind, this personality, this sense of self, if that's who we are, then we're vulnerable. Then there's a lot of people running around with sort of a mild or maybe a more severe sense of anxiety, right? Anxiety is a fairly rational reaction to our situation. Is it not? If we're out in a world where we're vulnerable, where anybody can say anything can happen, and things sometimes do happen, then, isn't, just a sort of underlying sense of anxiety, isn't that appropriate? If you don't know who you are, that's what we're left with. We're left with what the next person's going to say about us, what somebody's going to think about us, some story somebody might tell somebody else about us, maybe true, maybe not true. All goes on, right? If who we are is dependent on outside circumstances, it's only natural that we feel vulnerable, have to be on guard, have to be careful who we trust, who we don't trust, have to protect ourselves. So again, we come to the question, is that the life actually we're given? Or is that just a conclusion that we've reached about the world? And we believe it? Or is there another alternative? Is that the deepest level of reality? Who I am is what everybody else thinks and says about me. So there's a real easy test to know what's real and what's not real. You want to do it? It only takes 10 seconds, so Okay, ready, go. Okay? So everything that you didn't think about in those 10 seconds isn't real. If it were real, it couldn't just disappear because you weren't thinking about it, right? You're still here, still alive, still breathing. So your existence doesn't depend on anything that you didn't think about. If you didn't remember your name, you didn't remember whether you were a woman or a man, you didn't remember your age, whether you had kids or not, what profession you were, where you lived, where you were born, who your parents were, what your hopes were, what your opinions are, what your regrets are. All of that is pulled out of memory. But that's who we believe we are. We think it into existence over and over and over again until we conclude, no, that's what I am. If you didn't remember you had a body, everything else is brought back into memory over and over again. The stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, about what we believe, over and over and over again to reinforce this sense of a separate self. That we're separate from all of that out there. The downside of that is we feel separate from all of that that's out there, including other people, including nature, including the divine, because we inhabit this world that is composed of conceptual thought.